On behalf of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning and the National Library of Israel, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this special edition of TJHT Talks. As we mark the second anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in 2022, in the shadow of Hamas's October 7th deadly assault on Israel and the ensuing war and suffering, the collection of all manner of documentation, artifacts, and testimonials in real time is an imperative. To address this imperative, it is my honor to introduce our guest scholars, Dr. Sofia Diak, Director of the Center for Urban History in Lviv, Dr. Chaim Neria, Director of the Chaim and Hannah Solomon Judaica Collection at the National Library of Israel, and Dr. Katarzyna Persson, Deputy Director of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum in Warsaw. They will be joined by Toby Center's General Manager, Jakub Wyszak. As usual, for those of you who've been with us before, the conversation will run approximately 45 minutes and be followed by a Q&A session. We invite you to share or post your questions in the chat section. Chaim, Sofia, and Kasha, thank you for joining us in this timely edition. To paraphrase the title of Professor Samuel Cassow's seminal publication, Who Will Write Our History? How are we empowered and how do we empower others through the creation of living archives? Narrate our history. Kasha, if I may, let's begin with you. We're delighted again that you're all here and taking the time, especially as moments are precious. So, Kasha, if you would, can you provide our audience with a sort of a historical background, precedents of creating archives in the time of war and struggle? And to briefly introduce Emanuel Ringelblum, the archives, and Oneg Shabbat as a kind of an example, which leads us to what we're doing today. Kasha.
Of course. Thank you. And thank you for having me. This really is, I think, a great example of that and a very good historical example. The Underground Archive, the Warsaw Ghetto, comes from a realization of one man, Emanuel Ringelblum, that the Jewish community is in a unique place. And this is something he realizes immediately once the war starts. Already in 1939, he knows that these are unique times. And he also knows very quickly that hopefully quite soon, someone will be telling this story. And that he's in a unique place and has a unique opportunity to shape how this story will be told. Because it becomes quickly obvious that that story won't end well and that Jews will be the victims of it. And the story isn't told by victims. It's told by victors. It's told by bystanders. And what Ringelblum does is creates the archive an absolutely unique source base to tell the victim-led story of the Holocaust. That's what it becomes, and he succeeds. The archive is carried out by Emanuel Ringelblum and the growing number of associates, people who grew up around him in the Warsaw Ghetto from the moment it's being sealed off. So from autumn of 1940 until early 1943. It's extremely sophisticated in terms of methodology. It's a very sophisticated, complicated research program and project of telling story, of telling our history, as he says, and as Samuel Castle then writes in his book, of which you quoted, so of writing history that won't be told by Germans, that won't be told by Poles. It will be our history told by Jews and for the future Jewish historians.
Thank you, Kasha. In terms of the Ringelblum Archive as this extraordinary example and a treasure that we all, way beyond historians and you as academics, this is a treasure for everyone. And certainly an example of, as you said, this meticulous collection. It wasn't haphazard. It was actually thought out in such a strategic way. What can you tell us a little bit about who were these members of Oneg Shabbos? Who did they represent? How diverse were the collections? does the collection share the diversity of experiences and activity and resistance that was to be found in the ghetto?
Absolutely, as you well know, and this is really the unique aspect of the Ringelblum archive, because what Ringelblum could have done easily, considering what he set off to do, to write the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, prepare source base for future historians of the Warsaw Ghetto, the easiest thing and the best, most, I think, obvious thing he would have done would be to write heroic history of the Warsaw Ghetto, because he was not short of heroic stories. As we all know, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto has uniquely, lots of uniquely heroic aspects. There's stories of underground underground schooling, of hospitals, of cares for children, of political parties, of youth movements, to go on and on. And what he could have easily done was just, tell this story, gather all those sources, and have an incredible, unique, heroic story of the Warsaw Ghetto for those people, on the basis of which people would be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto in the future. But what he does is very different. He very consciously puts into the time capsule that becomes the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto stories which he doesn't agree with himself. He wants to put forward the whole incredibly complex story of a community in times of crisis, and of choices which people make in times of crisis, which are not necessarily heroic, which are sometimes very difficult to accept, which are incredibly difficult to accept for him. So the archive has also voices of people who participated in what was considered at that point collaboration, even though, of course, we wouldn't today. People who were refugees, who were deportees, who were dying of hunger, people who were making a lot of money out of smuggling, of women, of children, all those voices which were silent for many years, before and after the war, silenced as a maybe inappropriate way of talking about the Holocaust, maybe as not important. And he gave them space. He gave them space to talk about their experience. He gave them platform. The underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto listens to those voices very seriously and takes the story seriously. And all together, they were to create the true mosaic of experiences and of life in the ghetto. So this is something that is incredibly unique. If we think where they were, if they think what they wanted to do, to tell the story of the community, to say that to see that they chose stories which they didn't necessarily agree with, I think is something truly unique and very, very important.
Kasia, thank you very much for bringing all these sort of dimensions to our conversation. Certainly as historically, but also so contemporarily. And we'll come back. I would like to now ask Sophia to perhaps enlighten us, share with us when the collection of ephemera and documentation started in Ukraine. We can go back, of course, before, unfortunately, to 2014, but certainly in the contemporary time span that we are finding ourselves in, and who's involved in the collection and who's deciding what is collected, who's managing the collections, and who's actually, selecting those materials and for what purpose in terms of an archive for the future. So, Sophia, thank you. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Elise, for your invitation. And this is really true that documentation did not start in 2022. In 2014, one of the institutions which became more internationally known because of Nobel Prize, the Center for Civil Liberties, started documenting war crimes in Crimea and in occupied Donetsk and Luhansk region. And it's also good to see that an institution which is documenting human rights issue and violations. So it does resonate also very much with the story of Ringelblum, because he did come with a certain experience of his life in 30s. So everybody comes into the war, or war comes, or extreme experience comes we have to think about the background, what life was before, what were sensitivities, abilities, and at the end also capacities of doing something and how to do that. But of course, for us, the Center for Urban History, and for many people who institutions and individuals, it did start in February 2022 with massive shock and massive wave of what was unfolding as a war that we were not able to imagine of this kind of war in happening of that size. And it's very decentered. One of the features of how Ukrainian society resilience is about civil society, but it's about decentralization. And similarly, archiving and documenting is very decentralized. There are many initiatives. So there are really a spectrum we can speak about. So there are official institutions from the prosecution office for the war crimes. And right now, there are more than 120 open cases. This is documentation. So it's then there are state archives. Probably less documenting, but also digitizing heavily because so it's not only about documenting the war, but also preserving, digitizing what can be destroyed by the war. And then academic institutions, but also NGOs and individuals. So like seeing how this different initiatives emerging last year together with Institute for Human Sciences and their program documenting Ukraine. Institute of Human Sciences is based in Vienna. We thought that, there's a need for the network, like for networking. And we made an open call and for documentation symposium, right? Called it Most Documented War. Usually the last war is the most
documented. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So we do hope that the most is the last in a way. And there were like around 150 institutions and individuals who signed up from organizations which have international cooperation and capacity. To give you a sense, a gynecologist who is documenting experiences of pregnancy and childbirth in the context of war. So the spectrum is really big, and that's the challenge is right now that the war is ongoing. The volume of data, the volume and the access and the sensitivity of data, of sources, of this all is very much open. We are in the midst of something which is not closed, without closure yet, right? So this puts a lot of challenges and questions. I hope we will discuss in our conversation.
Sophia, thank you so much. And yes, this is part of a conversation amongst all of you, our guests. I would ask a question I was thinking, and you've already alluded to it, is how have things changed as the war continues and intensifies? But also in an age where social media just broadcasts everything, and it's all out there, which means the opportunity to deny, to manipulate, to spin a story or spin an image is so great. How do you find these collections? How do they create, first of all, of course, a vault for memory and testimony, etc., but how do archives manage to sort of bring other people into the truth, if I may?
This is a very good question, because there are different types of collecting and documentation. One thing is that a journalist takes an interview and puts it immediately, into, and that's another thing. And I think and you have to really keep in mind the time and temporality. So, for example, like oral history or oral testimonies that we are collecting, we are specifically telling people that we are not releasing them. Because that really tells, what people tell you in the interview. Because at the moment, it's not only about the data protection, but it's also it's about what kind of story people are willing to share, and it's really about story which sometimes gets dissonant or run against the narrative. That's things that you know that you will probably be able to disclose after.
After.
Um, choices people make, positions, and you don't share. It's very similar to what Kasia was mentioning. So society, in people have very different experiences, very different choices and backgrounds and opinions. And it's not about having one story, but rather having as many
Right.
voices as you can actually are able to access. And even if you're trying to access these voices or these experiences and be attentive listener and not be judgmental listener, there's always awareness that you can't reach some of them, and some of them you can't reach logistically. We can't go to occupied territories.
Right.
Some you can't access ideologically, right? So because
Yeah, interesting.
it's one thing, it's about recording voices of finding, or recording the evidences or the sources
Right.
of opposition to Russian occupation, and another way is actually how to get the stories of people who accept it,
Yes,
or how to record
absolutely.
the stories of people who support, because we probably can't hold the stories now, but we will need them later. Because
Interesting.
later we will have to understand. And of course, there is another big, which is beyond our purview here, is what is happening in Russian society. Like, of course, there are, a lot of documents will be, we do not know, official, but also, if we will have so much of oral history from Ukrainian society, what is about people who are in Russia? What do we know about them? And it's kind of more question to other researchers. Probably, we are not that much capable and possible to do that type of documentation, but that's keeping in mind that there are, there are those experiences which we are not very, which we can't or are unable to reach out, but that they will matter as well to make, to write maybe not the history, our history, but actually to understand what is happening and what has happened, and how that happened.
So, Sophia, thank you. I'm pulling the thread, if I can, between what Kasia has introduced and your input and contribution. And then we'll move on in a minute to Chaim. You see this sort of sense of, and it comes back to, and it's so hard to define, especially now, is the whole picture. And I think that Kasia mentioned it in terms of this sort of, I don't know, more hermetically sealed version from Emanuel Ringelblum and all of his associates. And also what you're saying is that in order to be a true archive of history, of experience, of realities, it has to be as complex, as you said, and as comprehensive as it can be, in order to bring that to the future. So, Chaim, we're happy to have you here on behalf of the National Library of Israel. I think pulling the thread forward or joining the dots from Kasia and Sophia, I'd like to start with a rather general question, as we had discussed earlier, is what is the National Library currently doing to document the October 7th massacre and the ensuing war and suffering that's going on?
So first, thank you very much for having me. I'm speaking from the new building of the National Library. We were supposed to open our doors just on October 21, a week of big celebration. We were supposed to have Lord Rothschild here, who just passed away, and many events for opening the building. But then on October 7th, 2 weeks before, the war started and everything was cancelled. We were still asking ourselves if this is the time to open a new building for the National Library. of Israel, but I think that it's also a symbolic decision
Mhm.
that even in time of war, we hold strong to the books, to the documentation. But I must say that from early on the first days, we were all in shock. Some of us, including myself, but I'm not the only one, lost relatives. People were in situation of immediate threat. And we had here, in terms of first defending the treasures of the National Library, to take them down to shelters. We didn't know what's going on. It was already on new exhibition. But then we realized that it was, I think, almost from the beginning, but for every day that passed, it was clear more and more that the National Library had a rule in this situation, um, to actively curating and documenting even that is time of crisis. So traditionally, I believe libraries would wait until
Hmm.
the books will
Interesting.
come, until the materials will come,
Hmm.
then they will do whatever collection of war or something
Hmm.
else. But the situation is that, again, things are happening, but not only that they are happening, you mentioned social media, digital, that
Mhm.
of the um, evidence, the stories, um, communication between people is going to disappear if we will not act
Mhm.
immediately to try to save them. Um, it could be documentation of WhatsApp conversation between certain communities on the south side while they are under attack. It could be pro-go pictures and live from Facebook by terrorists that when they realize that the pictures are not working for well for them in the overall opinion of the public opinion, so they started to take them down. And also in Israel itself, the mobilization of the communities to give back, to help, to send materials to the soldiers, to be with families, and so on. It's major, almost 90% of this it's made digital. So if and it's this, it simply can disappear. So we started now. In addition, we had another problem that there are local communities, mostly kibbutzim or yeshuvim in the south side, that usually they had and still having strong archives on the ground, which we don't know what happened with these archives, or would this archive will be saved or not. This is um, and we knew that at least some archive were saved. I mean, they could get hurt or even destroyed. So this is, and of course, as the National Library of Israel, which we do have the responsibility also to document, um, we do have now also many communities or are displaced communities. So how you document them. Sometimes the person who you were in immediate connection on, let's say, archiving the story of the community himself died. So who will replace him? Who you try to reconnect, find connection, and so on. Um, fortunately, in Israel, the documentation was not just important to the National Library. We have today almost 100 volunteer organizations that are doing all sorts of documentation projects, starting with collecting digital materials, mostly footage from online social media. This was also the first day helping to understand where people, if people got killed, if people were kidnapped, what's happened to them. So using AI and some other tools, they gather many footage and try to create a better picture, better understanding. And of course, so they were collecting materials. We have people who started to do oral testimonies, groups of artists that try to collect other materials, artifacts, or others ways that people try to give some ways and expression to their feeling and thoughts. And so we started with the National Library. We decided to do or to be the aggregator of
Mhm.
materials. So to offer first support, direction, and it's also, I mean, if you have a lot of digital materials, you need a storage. You need to pay
Right.
for that storage. So in Israel, this is the main, and also to do things by ourselves, especially things that we are very professional, to direct people how to collect, give a
Mhm. Mhm.
metadata, so we are holding all this. We created kind of consortium of all these groups and volunteers that are ready to participate, and then we are doing with them a program to create a big or national archive of what's happened in
Mhm.
Israel. Um,
Chaim, first of all, I know that, I mean, I know all of you have so much more to say. I'm sorry that we condensed all of it, but for our audience, this is the beginning, we hope, and also the beginning of our conversations with your colleagues as we all go farther. I wanted to pick up on something that you had mentioned. We're talking about, I mean, Ringelblum, as we know, that was a very specific place, time, almost kind of, as we said, almost sealed. Connections with outside Poland certainly were probably non-existent, though information was gathered from outside the Warsaw Ghetto, as I understand. And Sophia mentioned, you know, reaching out to other, I don't know, I don't want to say stakeholders in this war. And I imagine we will reach out to Ukrainian refugees around the world because their story is another piece of this. But Chaim, you know, to that point, you mentioned the fact that there are Jewish communities around the world in the diaspora who are collecting and responding to this situation, you know, both individually but communally. And I would like you, can you speak a little bit about
sure.
to that, you know, to that question?
So we are trying to create also and to collect materials from Jewish communities around the world. It's more difficult because we are far away, but and with the help of Rothschild and the Europe, we will have a special person that will be placed here in Israel, but will try to create connections and relations with communities in Europe to collect from the materials, because as you said,
Yeah.
we feel that it's not just about Israel or Israelis, it's in fact also Jewish communities around the world, whether it will be prayers or vigils or
Mhm.
going to marching or afraid from anti-Semitism or even debating what is the true or right or correct ways to and we felt that it will be the picture will not be full picture if we will not have the voice of Jewish communities in the diaspora. So we actively working to try to collect the materials from the Jewish communities in the diaspora as well.
Thank you, Chaim. That adds yet another layer. I feel a little bit, speaking to you, each of you as historians, that we sort of started, I mean, in the last 100 years, but maybe obviously less. And unfortunately, where we are in our contemporary times, the need to archive is ever so much more present. And as you've all said, the ability to do so is both a blessing and a curse in terms of how we collect, how we share, and how we manage. I would like to take this time for each of you perhaps to ask each other a question or to speak to one of the points that has been made. Unfortunately, we would have to kind of bracket that time, but we hope this is the beginning of other conversations in the future. And so perhaps I'd like to start with Sophia. What would you like to bring to your colleagues or share that you haven't already shared?
It's there's this question of ephemeral sources, like in digital, right? And that's this the depth of digital media, and we do have I mentioned about social media, and we are collecting and Telegram channels. Telegram is a messenger that is very spread in Ukraine, which is a messenger but also news. So this is the question also, how do you carve the choice, which channels you, because we were curating how everything that is related to the war, but also to specific localities where the front line is, but also places which are now under occupation. So there is a lot of sensitive data, there is a lot of sensitive information, and it's a question also of access, how you give this access. So it's something that we work a lot, not only us, but many, how to create digital environment which helps to preserve, but also how to gradually give access, and that this is not, because you can't also control how it will be used. You can, there are certain formats, of course. So that's a question also how this long life. And I think that it's also, I think that the biggest voice that which I found, and I was still a student, a PhD student, of the like this braveness of Ringelblum, like looking into places where you don't look, things which are not like glorious for your national story. And I think that this is a very thin line, and I'm also very like thinking a lot, what is the difference between story and national story, right? So who gets the place in story and who gets the place, no place in national story. So this is also, it's a very probably it's a question also within Israeli society is also very diverse, and it's also Ukrainian society is very diverse, and what voices we collect is also creates the outlines of society. And I'm also sometimes thinking, which voices we don't have or we don't want to have. So my question also would be to what voices you don't have, and you kind of don't know if you would like to have. I'm just like also like So this is a type of the issues or the type of the question that as a historian who might be in the future might be asking sometimes. And I'm just thinking that maybe in my position, which is the position in the present, both as a historian, but also as a citizen of country which is under attack. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile, but it's definitely worth of asking. So that's if the questions like that you ask. And maybe Kasia, if you could think, how, the Ringelblum eye on that would be, what his take would be on such questions.
I think this is such a great topic. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. The more I get into the archive, the more I sort of start asking myself, to what extent do we have right to these stories? There is actually explicitly a story in the Ringelblum archive, a story of someone gathering testimonies and of one person refusing to do so because telling them this is my story. I'm not willing to share it because of the state I'm in at that point. It's someone who's a refugee and who is at that point dying and refusing to let that person in to interview them and saying, this is the place I'm in now is not who I am, and I'm not willing to share that story. And I feel sometimes that, even though those stories, happened over 8 years ago now, that some of them are very private and, they're fantastic historical source, but to what extent do we really have right, even 8 years on, to enter people's privacy? Of course, it's also the issue of pictures with everything that we as historians see as an incredibly interesting, fascinating source, but that strongly invades other people's privacy, and whether they would have wanted us, to share it, to see it, and so on and so on. So this is something that I think is also joining all our three stories, and that's something that's interesting, and to what extent the need to tell the story gives us the right to invade other people's, personal stories in a way. To what extent do we have right to do so? So this is something that I'm always I think we're all struggling with in a way, and something that's really interesting. And regarding Ringelblum, that's also interesting, of course, because he was a person with a very clear view of the world, I think. And if you read his personal writings, he's not exactly a person who sees many shades of gray. He was a man who saw most things in white and black, and yet he lets those shades of gray into the archive, which is and consciously makes a choice to let in those stories which are completely against his personal worldview. And I think there's also a sign of his greatness in a way as well. So there is this connection between the maker of the archive in a way, and the archive is also something that I think is fascinating. But what you said about the privacy is great.
It's also like, if you might join, there is this difference between the archive making and the writing later. So because not all the stories will be written and there will be time for them the questions will be. So there are years ahead and different questions will emerge. We will be a society, or people will be able to, and I think that this is at the moment of collecting, it's really going beyond it's maybe going beyond your personal, political, national, your framework, kind of be as inclusive as you can possibly be and beyond in a way. And then it's kind of the possibility for the future. And maybe some questions won't be asked and some sources will not be checked. That's also, not all sources are checked or retrieved from archive. That's and there are questions which we are now incapable of asking, but we might be in whatever time later.
If I may,
Please.
I think that at least from my knowledge, the attempt to document or during crisis started at least in war Jewry during Kishinev pogrom, where people were sent immediately So it started in Western Europe, and it was different than the in Eastern Europe, and it was different from the German way of analyzing historical events, which always ask for the long perspective. So I say that because also at the beginning, I knew about the Ringelbaum and other. We do have also the Vilnius Ghetto Archive, some of this here. So we know I knew about attempts to collect during the time and during the crisis, but you start and you think you do it you are the first one who do such a kind of work. And I say again, for the National Library it was new, but then you realize that there is a history and there is a lot of experience. And I think the questions that Sophia, you asked, and Kasha, you raised, are questions that we are, as we go and as we moving, as more we collect, we ask ourselves more and more questions on consent, on access. I mean, this was, in our case, question of access to movies, which we know how terrible they are. So even in the terms of the people who may try to catalog such a movie, it's terrible experience. So how we keep our workers safe and not experiencing the trauma while they are doing this kind of work. So it's involved a lot gender question. It's involved a lot of questions that we are trying to ask ourselves all the time. I don't think that we have a clear answer, but I think that asking the question is by itself suggests kind of acknowledgement that what you do, it's not such a simple but very complicated. And also we have we are trying maybe to establish a national story, but like I said, maybe there is a community story that it's different, or personal story. So, but eventually I believe that from collecting all kind of voices, we will have a better picture. We use for a tool to archiving the internet, and in Israel, in terms of rights, legal rights to make it access later on, it's more simple. But again, if we want to do it in other places, it's become more complicated, and we don't have good tools yet as to archive social media, like you raised Telegram or Facebook, or Twitter was open at the beginning, but recently closed your ability to archive. But we still try to do what we can do. And of course, the best is if people are sharing with us what they are ready to share. So this will be give us the consent and the ability to make everybody access these materials. This will be the simplest way, but if not, it will be more problematic.
Chaim, thank you, Sophia and Kasha. Let me just say, I know I don't want to stop, but maybe one final comment from each of you, and then I would like to invite Jakub to share a bit about what the Toby Center has been doing, in this case, in support of Ukrainian refugees and in support of Ukraine as best we can, and also illustrating the point that you all made, that we're all responsible, and some of us have a moral. I think we all have a moral responsibility, but in your positions as historians and archives, the decisions you have to make. I mean, I think Kasha mentioned this because she's got a past she's dealing with the past, with questions for the future, the present and the future. But what are those moral dilemmas that we face, as you've all articulated so beautifully, in terms of sharing, and also that little voice in your head, as you suggested, Sophie, is I don't want them, but I have to ask because this is my responsibility, even if, and as Ringelblum points out, these are not his views, but they needed to be represented. And I'm sure, Chaim, you're also dealing with that. So we applaud all of your work. So one more round of comment before we move on. Kasia, you began, so we'll let you have this honor.
Well, I think incredibly inadequate here. So I would just like to say thank you for everything you do, as like the only person here who's not really involved in doing things right now. It's absolutely incredible. And yeah, I don't know if it's even appropriate to say that, in a sense that this is incredible. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Kasia. Chaim, you're the last to speak, but now you're in the middle of the Oreo cookie.
So I would ask everybody, we have a link on our website to share materials. So even if you took a picture of yourself, you wrote something, you take a part in any event, so it will be very important for us if you are ready and willing to share with us. It will take some time, but we need this metadata and permission. And please, I mean, we need your voices, so we would be happy and thankful if the voice, or if each of the listeners or the participants will be ready to share even one small thing with us.
Chaim, thank you very much. Sophia, to share any connection that people can contribute to. We're more than happy to share the link in the follow-up email that people will receive along with a link to the program, but people who were unable to join us will also have that opportunity. And our commitment is to making the global conversation larger. And Sophia, a final, not final, but for the book, for the
Final,
time.
no, I do hope that it's, yeah, I mean, it's hard to find words to conclude this rich conversation, a very diverse one. I don't know, probably towards the end, I would say that, there is this archive and the people, historians and non-historians, but I think at the very end, we actually much more than that. We are, we are co-citizens, we are people who live and share life, and the life is connected, across the boundaries. And in documentation, there is a very important supportive and therapeutic, listening to stories, sharing a story. And as we go really through very hard times, and we are all exhausted, and the world is so uncertain, and so much anxiety, we do hope that history has future, and it's even more important, to show to support to each other, to fellow human beings, and to and to oppose the injustice and try to fill each other a little bit, that we will endure, and that there will be a better world to live. That's probably, and then we will be writing the history.
Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing and your comments and your insights. In a minute, I will introduce Jakob to share some of the here and now from our perspective, which is, in a sense, your final comments, Sophia, in terms of connecting all of us is really important. And the sense that it's not only it's here and now, but it's us. I mean, no matter where we are, if we're in Israel or in Ukraine or we're in Poland or we're in the United States or in any place that is any kind of, certainly war, but any kind of moral crisis in terms of the future, it's important for us to know that we can share and we can contribute, even if there's not something that we can actually physically do. So if we're delighted that you've joined us again at the end, we will certainly invite you back. It's a pleasure to have this conversation grow with all of you. And I'd like to take this opportunity. Jakob Wieszak, who's our general manager, he's just returned from a trip to Israel, but he has been at the forefront of the Toby Center's response to the brutal invasion of Russia in 2022, in terms of serving refugees in Poland, but also taking much needed goods into Ukraine as far as possible. So Jakob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Where would you like to start? Maybe you could start with the conversation you and I had on February 24th, 2022.
Okay, thank you, Kasia, Sofia, and Haim. And so when the war started, we all were watching news and attending the demonstrations, but we thought that it's not enough. So I asked Halis for permission to skip one day of work and go to one of the border crossings to take care about the refugees who are coming. And to make the long story short, thanks to general donations from our audience and from the Taubi Philanthropies and other organizations, at the beginning of the war, we were able to transfer over 1,100 refugees from the border crossing to Warsaw and Kraków. With some of them, we are in touch all the time. With some of them, we completely don't know what's happening. And from this time, we are taking care about the refugees in Warsaw. We created together with Hillel Warsaw and JCC Warsaw space in our office. We created summer and winter camps for kids. Is that correct, Halis?
Yes. And we've been working with one organization in particular, Jakob, the Ukrainian Mothers House. And can you tell us a little bit more about what the needs are, how people are faring, unfortunately, 2 years later, and still refugees?
Correct. The Ukrainian Mother House in Warsaw, it's one of many organizations that's taking care about the newborns and their mothers. So taking care about the new generation of the Ukrainians, the newborns and the toddlers that are lacking of nutrition. And one of the places that we are supporting is hosting over 40 people, so 8 mothers and 32 kids. And apart of providing them monthly support, we are also helping them with the action that they are performing on every couple of weeks, which is giving away the packages of food for over 200 other refugees, mostly mother and kids that are not living at this house, but are living in the surrounding area in Warsaw.
And if you could, before we finish, Jakob, you're planning a trip to Ukraine tomorrow. Where are you going and what are you taking?
Correct. Since the September 2022, after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, we started to go inside Ukraine, even to the front lines, delivering the medical aid and other support for the fighting soldiers, but also for the civilians. We are cooperating very closely with the municipality of Novovolinsk, which is the city in the western Ukraine between Lutsk and Lviv. And among other things, we delivered over 3,000 meters of the polar fleece to create the much needed winter clothes for soldiers and for civilians. And our other way of supporting is to help other organizations that doesn't have the means of transport to deliver the humanitarian aid from Poland to Warsaw, or from Poland to Ukraine, or around Poland, for example, from Silesia, from Katowice to Mother House, or to different organizations. So one of our most important activities right now is helping with the transportation inside Poland and to Ukraine.
Jakob, thank you. Go in, go safely, come back safely. So to our audience and to our guests, thank you for joining us. I feel that there are no words to say thank you for all that is being done, whether it's materially or physically or emotionally or historically in these times of war and crisis. We all, as we said, we support each other in doing what we can do from our own place, from our own experiences, and we're extremely grateful. I hope the next time we meet, it should be soon. Ukraine is victorious, the war in Israel is over, the hostages have been returned, and we begin to reconstruct our lives and our cultures and our society. For all of you, again, who joined us, thank you. Please share the link that you'll receive with others who may have not been with us. We will do the same. And we look forward to seeing all of you in March. And I would like to close this way thanking all of the donors who have shared your generosity with us as the Toby Center, enabling us to deliver and to assist as best we can. So I say good day, good night. Dziękujemy bardzo, toda raba. Thank you in Ukrainian. And may we all gather in a time of peace and begin to assess. So now that we've made these collections, what are we going to do? And what is our obligation? So thank you. All be well, please.